Hey everybody. This is the third video out of 5 for part 2 of Adorno's negative dialectics. Part 2 of negative dialectics is titled Negative Dialectics Concept and Categories. And the first section is Essence and Appearance. When a category changes, as those of identity and totality do in negative dialectics, a change occurs in the constellation of all categories, and thus again in each one. Paradigmatically for this phenomenon are the concepts of essence and appearance. They come from philosophical tradition and are maintained in negative dialectics. But their directional tendency is reversal. Essence can no longer be hypostatized as the pure spiritual being in itself. Rather, essence passes into that which lies concealed beneath the facade of immediacy, of the supposed facts, and which makes the facts what they are. I come to be, to me. It comes to be the law of doom, thus far obeyed by history. A law the more irresistible, the more it will hide beneath the facts, only to be comfortably denied by them. Such essence, to begin with, is the fatal mischief of a world arranged so as to degrade men to means of their cesse conserver. A world that curtails and threatens their life by reproducing it and making them believe that it has this character so as to satisfy their needs. This essence, too, must come to appear like Hegel's, swathed in its own contradiction. It can be recognized only by the contradiction between what things are and what they claim to be. True vis-a-vis the alleged facts, this essence also is conceptual rather than immediate. But such conceptuality is no mere, some word in Greek, no mere product of the cognitive subject, in which the subject ultimately finds itself confirmed. Instead, the conceptuality expresses the fact that no matter how much blame may attach to the subject's contribution, the conceived world is not its own, but a world hostile to the subject. All but unrecognizably, this is attested by Husserl's doctrine of essence perception. What this amounts to is that the essence is totally alien to the consciousness that grasps it. The doctrine recalls, albeit in the fetishistic form of a downright absolute, quote, ideal sphere, end quote, that even the concepts with which it unhesitatingly equates its essentialities are not only products of syntheses and abstractions, they also represent a moment in the multiplicity which idealistic doctrine views as summoning the merely posited concepts. Husserl's idealism, an ontologization of the pure mind, was hypertrophied and therefore long unrecognizable even to Husserl himself. In his most effective writings, it helped to give distorted expression to an anti-idealistic motive, to discontent with the thesis of the thinking subject's universal rule. Phenomenology forbade the prescription of laws by a subject that was already obliged to obey them. In that sense, the subject experiences something objective in the laws. Yet because Husserl, like the idealist, put all mediations on the noetic side, on the subjects, he could not conceive the objective moment in the concept as anything but an immediacy sui generis, and he was forced to commit an act of epistemological violence and copy the mediations from sense perception. He frantically denied their essence on its part is another moment nonetheless, sprung from a source. Hegel, whom Husserl condemned with the hauteur of arrogance, had the superior insight that the essence categories in Volume 2 of his Logic are evolved, products of the self-reflection of the categories of being, as well as objectively valid. This is beyond the thinking of anti-dialectical zealots. Although Husserl's basic theme, his logical propositions, ought to have thrust dialectics upon him. For those propositions are no more objective in character, no more, quote, laws of essence, end quote, in line with his theory, than a fact he first passes over in silence. They are tied to thinking and centrally dependent upon that which they in turn are not. The, quote, absolute of logical absolutism derives its title from the validity of formal theses and of mathematics. Even so, it is not absolute because the claim of absoluteness, in the sense of a positively achieved identity of subject and object, is qualified itself. The precipitation of the claim of subjective totality. But the dialectics of essence, as of something which in its way, so to speak, simultaneously is and is not, can by no means be resolved as it is by Hegel, in the unity of the producing and produced mind. Hegel's doctrine of the objectivity of essence postulates that being is the mind that has not yet come to itself. Essence recalls the non-identity in the concept of that which, by the subject, is not posited but followed. Even the division of logic and mathematics from the ontical realm, the division upon which rests the appearance of their being in themselves, the ontological interpretation of formal categories, even this retains an ontical aspect, a recoil from the ontical, as it would have been called by Hegel. That ontical moment is reproduced in logic and mathematics, since they cannot see themselves as separate and qualified, for to be separate is their very essence. They achieve a kind of existence. Even more, however, do the essential laws of society and of its motion come to exist. They are more real than the facts in which they appear, the facts which deceive us about them, but they discard the traditional attributes of their essentiality. They might be called the reduction to a concept of the negativity that makes the world the way it is. Nietzsche, the irreconcilable adversary of our theological heritage in metaphysics, had ridiculed the difference between essence and appearance. Nietzsche had relegated the, quote, background world, end quote, to the, quote, backwoodsman, end quote, concurring here with all positivism. Nowhere else, perhaps, is it so palpable how an indefatigable enlightenment will profit the obscurantist. Essence is what must be covered up, according to the mischief-making law of unessentiality. To deny that there is an essence means to side with appearance, with the total ideology which existence has since become. If a man rates all phenomena alike because he knows of no essence that would allow him to discriminate, he would, in a fanaticized love of truth, make common cause with untruth. He will join hands with Nietzsche's despised scientific stupor that will not bother with the dignity of objects to be dealt with, and will either parrot public opinion about this dignity or choosing the criterion of whether, as they say, a thing, quote, has not been worked upon as yet, end quote. The scientific mentality cedes the decision about essentiality and unessentiality to the disciplines which deal with the object at the particular time. This is essential to what is essential to one may be unessential to the other. Hegel, concurring, puts the difference into a third, which initially lies outside the thing's imminent motion. Footnote, quote, insofar as as an essential and an unessential part of an existence are differentiated, therefore, this difference is outwardly posited, a segregation of one part from another part of the existing thing, not touching its existence itself. It is a separation which falls into a third, and in which it is indefinite what belongs to the essential or to the unessential. It is some sort of external consideration and contemplation that makes the difference, and the same content is therefore to be regarded now as essential, now as unessential. End quote. Hegel. End footnote. Ironically, Husserl, who would not dream of any dialectics between essence and appearance, remains in the right against Hegel. There actually is a mental experience, fallible indeed, but immediate, of the essential and the unessential, an experience which only the scientific need for order can forcibly talk the subjects out of. Where there is no such experience, knowledge stays unmoved and barren. Its measure is what happens objectively to the subjects as they're suffering. The theoretical leveling of essence and appearance will be paralleled by subjective losses. Along with their faculty of suffering and happiness, the knowers lose the primary capacity to separate essentials and unessentials, without anyone really knowing what is cause and what is effect. The stubborn urge to check the accuracy or irrelevancies, rather than to reflect on relevancy at the risk of error, is one of the most widespread symptoms of a regressive consciousness. No background world annoys the latest type of backwoodsman. He happily buys what the foreground world will sell him on, in words or in silence. Positivism becomes ideology in eliminating first the objective category of essence and then, consistently, the concern with essentials. But it is by no means exhausted in its hidden universal law. Its positive potential survives in what the law affects, in what is flung aside as unessential to the verdict of the world's course. When we consider it, taking a far more than psychological view of that Freudian, quote, dross of the phenomenal world, end quote, we mean the particular as the non-identical. The essential runs counter to the prevailing generality, to the mischief of unessentiality, just as far as criticism will outstrip that generality. New section, indirectness by objectivity. In negative dialectics, not even the transmission of essence and phenomenality, of concept and thing, will remain what it was, the subjective moment in the object. What transmits the facts is not so much the subjective mechanism of their preformation and comprehension as it is assuming it's dirt. God, I need to clean the screen. What transmits the fact is not so much the subjective mechanism or their preformation and comprehension as it is the objectivity heteronymous to the subject. The objectivity behind that which the subject can experience. This objectivity is denied to the primary realm of subjective experience. It is preordinated to that realm. Wherever, in the current manner of speaking, judgment is too subjective, at the present historical stage, the subject, as a rule, will automatically parrot the consensus omnium. The consensus omnium. To give the object its due instead of being content with the false copy, the subject would have to resist the average value of such objectivity and to free itself as a subject. It is on this emancipation, not on the subject's insatiable repression, that objectivity depends today. The superiority of objectification in the subjects not only keeps them from becoming subjects, it equally prevents a cognition of objectivity. This is what became of what used to be called, quote, the subjective factor, end quote. It is now subjectivity rather than objectivity that is indirect, and this sort of mediation is more in need of analysis than the traditional one. The subjective mechanism of mediation served to lengthen the objective ones to which each subject, including the transcendental one, is harnessed. The presubjective order, which in turn essentially constitutes the subjectivity that is constitutive for epistemology, sees to it that data are apperceived in this way and in no other, according to their claim. What in the Kantian deduction of categories remains ultimately, quote, given, and by Kant's own admission accidental, and that reason can have these and no other basic concepts at its disposal, is attributed to what the categories, according to Kant, have yet to establish. But the fact that indirectness is universal, does not entitle us to reduce all things between heaven and earth to its level, as if transmitting an immediacy were the same as transmitting a concept. To concepts, mediation is essential. The concept itself is immediately by nature its own transmission. But the indirectness of something direct is a reflexive determination that makes sense only in regard to its opposite, the direct thing. There is nothing that is not transmitted, and yet, as Hegel emphasized, indirectness must always refer to some transmitted thing, without which there would be no indirectness. That there is no transmitted thing without indirectness, on the other hand, is a purely private and epistemological fact, the expression of our inability to define, quote, something, without mediation, and little more than the tautology that to think something is to think. Conversely, there would be no mediation without, quote, something, end quote. Directness does not involve being transmitted in the same sense in which indirectness involves something direct that would be transmitted. Hegel neglected this difference. The transmission of something direct refers to its mode, to knowledge of it, and to the bounds of such knowledge. Immediacy is no modality, no mere definition of the, quote, how for a consciousness. It is objective. Its concept, the concept of immediacy, points to that which cannot be removed by its own concept. Mediation makes no claim whatever to exhaust all things. Mediation postulates, rather, that what it transmits is not thereby exhausted. Directness itself, on the other hand, stands for a moment that does not require cognition or mediation in the same sense in which cognition necessitates immediacy. As long as philosophers employ the concepts, quote, direct and, quote, indirect, concepts they cannot forego for the time being, their language will bear witness to the facts denied by the idealist version of dialectics. That this version ignores the seemingly minimal difference serves to make it plausible. The triumphant finding that immediacy is wholly indirect rides roughshod over indirectness, and blithely ends up with the totality of the concept, which nothing non-conceptual can stop anymore. It ends up with the absolute rule of the subject. In dialectics, however, it is not total identification that has the last word. because dialectics lets us recognize the difference that has been spirited away. Dialectics can break the spell of identification without dogmatically, from without, contrasting it with an allegedly realistic thesis. The circle of identification, which in the end always identifies itself alone, was drawn by a thinking that tolerates nothing outside it. Its imprisonment is its own handiwork. Such totalitarian and therefore particular rationality was historically dictated by the threat of nature. That is its limitation. Inferior bondage to nature is perpetuated by a thinking that identifies, that equalizes everything unequal. Thoughtless rationality is blinded to the rule of madness by the sight of whatsoever will elude its rule. For the present reason is pathic. Nothing but to cure ourselves of it would be rational. Even the theory of alienation, the ferment of dialectics, confuses the need to approach the heteronymous and thus irrational world, to be, quote, at home everywhere, end quote, as Novalis put it, with the archaic barbarism that the longing subject cannot love what is alien and different, with the craving for incorporation and persecution. If the alien were no longer ostracized, there hardly would be any more alienation. New section, particularity and the particular. The equivocation in the concept of indirectness causes the opposite poles of cognition to be equated at the expense of their qualitative difference. The difference on which simply everything depends. This equivocation dates back to abstraction. The word, quote, abstract is still too abstract. However, it too is equivocal. The unity of that which general concepts cover differs fundamentally from the conceptually defined particular. The concept of the particular is always its negation at the same time. It cuts short what the particular is and what nonetheless cannot be directly named, and it replaces this with identity. This negative, wrong, and yet simultaneously necessary moment is the stage of dialectics. The core, which is also abstract in the idealist version, is not simply eliminated. Its distinction from, quote, nothing means that, contrary to Hegel, even the most indefinite, quote, something, end quote, would not be downright indefinite. This refutes the idealist doctrine of the subjectivity of all definitions. The particular would not be definable without the universal that identifies it, according to current logic, but neither is it identical with the universal. The idealist will not see that, however devoid of qualities, quote, something may be, this is no reason yet to call it, quote, nothing. Hegel is constantly forced to shadow box because Hegel shrinks from his own conception, from the dialectics of the particular, which destroy the primacy of identity and thus, consistently, idealism itself. For the particular, he substitutes the general concept of particularization, pure and simple, of, quote, existence, with a Z. For instance, in which the particular is not particular anymore. He restores the thinking procedure which Kant rightly chided in an earlier rationalism as the amphiboly of reflexive concepts. Hegel's dialectics turn sophisticated where it miscarries. What makes a dialectical impulse of the particular, its indissolubility in the cover concept, is treated as a universal state of facts, as if the particular were its own cover concept and indissoluble for that reason. This is precisely what reduces the dialectics of non-identity and identity to a mere semblance. Identity wins over non-identity. The shortcomings of a cognition that can make sure of no particular without the concept, which is anything but the particular, these shortcomings redound, legerdemain fashion, to the advantage of the mind that will rise above the particular and cleanse the particular of all that resists the concept. The general concept of particularity has no power over the particular, which the concept means in abstracting. New section, Subject-Object Dialectics. The polarity of subject and object may well appear to be an undialectical structure in which all dialectics takes place. But the two concepts are resultant categories of reflection, formulas for an irreconcilability. They are not positive primary states of fact, but negative throughout, expressing nothing but non-identity. Even so, the difference between subject and object cannot be simply negated. They are neither an ultimate duality nor a screen hiding negated. Even so, the difference between subject and object cannot be simply negated. They are neither an ultimate duality nor a screen hiding ultimate unity. Subject and object constitute one another as such, as by virtue of such constitution they depart from each other. If the dualism of subject and object were laid down as a basic principle, it would, like the identity principle, to which it refuses to conform, be another total monism. Absolute duality would be unity. Hegel used this for the purpose of taking the subject-object polarity into his thinking after all. It was due to its bilateral unfoldment that he felt himself ranking above Fichte and Schelling. As the structure of being, he held, the dialectics of subject and object come to be the subject. Footnote, quote, indeed, the grasp of an object consists in nothing else but that an eye will make the object that eyes known, will penetrate it, and will bring it into its own form, i.e. into the universality which immediately is definition, or into definition, which immediately is universality. In visuality or even in visualization, the object is still something external and strange. By grasping it, the being in and for itself, which the object has in visuality and visualization, is transformed into posited being. The eye penetrates it in thought. Yet the object is in and for itself as it is in thought. It is phenomenal as it is in visuality and visualization. Thinking voids the immediacy of our first encounter with it, and thus turns it into a posited being. Yet this posited being is its being in and for itself, or its objectivity. Thus the object has this objectivity in the concept, and the concept is the unity of the self-consciousness in which it has been received. Its objectivity, or the concept itself, is therefore nothing but the nature of this self-consciousness, and has no other moment of definition than the I itself. End quote. Hegel. End footnote. Both, as abstractions, are thought products. The supposition of their antithesis inevitably declares thinking to be primary. Yet the dualism will not take the hint of a pure thought either. While this remains a thought, it will occur in line with the dictum the dichotomy that has become the thought form and without which there might be no thought. Every concept, even that of being, reproduces the difference of thinking and the thought. The difference has been seared into our theoretical awareness of the antagonistic state of reality. Insofar as it expresses that condition, the falsehood of dualism is truth. Detached therefrom, on the other hand, the antagonism would become the philosophical excuse put forward to explain why dualism is eternal. The only possible course is definite negation of the individual moments, whereby subject and object are turned into absolute opposites, and precisely thus are identified with each other. In truth, the subject is never quite the subject, and the object never quite the object. And yet the two are not pieced out of any third that transcends them. The third would be no less deceptive. The Kantian answer, withdrawing the third as infinite from positive finite cognition and using its unattainability to spur cognition to untiring effort, falls short. The duality of subject and object must be critically maintained against the thought's inherent claim to be total. The division, which makes the object the alien thing to be mastered and appropriates it, is indeed subjective, the result of orderly preparation, but no critique of its subjective origin will reunify the parts once they have split in reality. Consciousness boasts of uniting what it has arbitrarily divided first into elements, hence the ideological overtone of all talk of synthesis. It serves to cover up an analysis that is concealed from itself and has increasingly become taboo. The reason why a vulgar nobility of consciousness feels antipathetic to analysis is that the fragmentation for which the bourgeois spirit will upbraid its critics is that spirit's own unconscious world. The rational processes of labor are a model of that fragmentation. They need it as a condition of the production of goods, which resembles the general conceptual procedure of synthesis. If Kant's critique of reason had included the relation between his method and theory, the relation of the epistemologically examining subject to the examined subject, it would not have escaped him that the forms which are to synthesize diversity are products in turn of the operations on which the structure of his work, revealingly enough, bestows the title of, quote, transcendental analytics, end quote. New section. Reversal of the subjective reduction. The prevailing trend in epistemological reflection was to reduce objectivity more and more to the subject. This very tendency needs to be reversed. The means employed by philosophical tradition to distinguish the concept of subjectivity from entity are copied from entity. That philosophy, suffering of deficient self-reflection to this day, forgot the mediation in the mediating subject, is no more indicative of meritorious sublimity than any forgetting. As though to punish it, the subject will be overcome by what it has forgotten. It no sooner turns into an object of epistemological reflection then it will share that objective character whose absence is so often cited as elevating it above the factual realm. The subject's essentiality is an existence raised to the second potency, and, as Hegel did not fail to state, presupposes the first potency, factuality. Factuality is a condition of the possibility, even though negated, of essentiality. The immediacy of primary reactions was broken, first in the formation of the I, and broken with these reactions was the spontaneity which the pure I, according to transcendental custom, is to contract into. The centristic identity of the I is acquired at the expense of what idealism will then attribute to it. The constitutive subject of philosophy is more of a thing than the specific psychological content which it excreted, as naturalistic and reified. The more autocratically the I rises above entity, the greater its imperceptible objectification and ironic retraction of its constitutive role. Not only the pure I is ontically transmitted by the empirical I, the unmistakably pellucid model of the first version of the deduction of purely rational concepts, the transcendental principle itself, the supposed, quote, first of philosophy as against entity, is so transmitted. Alfred's own Rettel was the first to point out that hidden in this principle, in the general and necessary activity of the mind, lies work of an inalienably social nature. The apparetical concept of the transcendental subject, a non-entity which is nonetheless to act, a universal which is nonetheless to have particular experiences, would be a soap bubble, never obtainable from the autarkic immanent context of consciousness, which is necessarily individual. Compared with consciousness, however, the concept represents not only something more abstract, by virtue of its coining power, it also represents something more real, beyond the magic circle of identitarian philosophy. The transcendental subject can be deciphered as a society unaware of itself. Such unawareness is deducible, ever since mental and physical labor were separated in the sign of the dominant mind, the sign of justified privilege. The separated mind has been obliged, with the exaggeration due to a bad conscience, to vindicate the very claim to dominate which it derives from the thesis that it is primary and original, and to make every effort to forget the source of its claim, lest the claim lapse. Deep down, the mind feels that its stable dominance is no mental rule at all, that its ultima ratio lies in the physical force at its disposal. On pain of perdition, however, it must not put its secret into words, abstraction, without which the subject would not be the constituens at large at all, not even according to some extreme idealist as Fichte, reflects the separation from physical labor, perceptible by confrontation with that labor. When Marx, in his critique of the Gotha platform, told the Lassalleans that in contrast to the customary litany of popular socialists, labor was not the sole source of social wealth, he was philosophically, at a time when the official philosophical thematics lay already behind him, saying no less than that labor could not be hypostatized in any form, neither in the form of diligent hands, nor in that of mental production. But hypostasis merely extends the illusion of the predominance of the productive principle. It comes to be true only in relation to that non-identical moment which Marx in his disdain for epistemology called first by the crude, too narrow name of, quote, nature, later on by that of, quote, natural material, end quote, and by other less incriminated terms. The essence of the transcendental subject, ever since the critique of pure reason, has been functionality, the pure activity that occurs in the achievements of individual subjects and surpasses them at the same time. It is a projection of freely suspended labor on the pure subject as its origin. In further restricting the subject's functionality by calling it empty and void, without a fitting material, Kant undauntedly notes that social labor is a labor on something. His more consistent idealistic successors did not hesitate to eliminate this. Yet the generality of the transcendental subject is that of the functional concept of society, of a whole that coalesces from individual spontaneities and qualities, delimits them in turn by the leveling barter principle, and virtually deletes them as helplessly dependent on the whole. The universal domination of mankind by the exchange value, a domination which a priori keeps the subjects from being subjects and degrades subjectivity itself to a mere object, makes an untruth of the general principle that claims to establish the subject's predominance. The surplus of the transcendental subject is the deficit of the utterly reduced empirical subject. New section. Interpreting the transcendental. As the extreme borderline case of ideology, the transcendental subject comes close to truth. The transcendent generality is no mere narcissist self-exaltation of the I, not the hubris of an autonomy of the I. Its reality lies in the domination that prevails and perpetuates itself by means of the principle of equivalence, the process of abstraction, which philosophy transfigures, and which it ascribes to the knowing subject alone, is taking place in the factual barter society. The definition of the transcendental as that which is necessary, a definition added to functionality and generality, expresses the principle of the self-preservation of the species. It provides a legal basis for abstraction, which we cannot do without. The abstraction is the medium of self-preserving reason. It would not take much artifice to parody Heidegger by interpreting the general philosophical idea of necessity as the need to reverse want, to remedy the lack of foodstuffs by organized labor. Thereby, of course, Heidegger's language mythology itself would be unhinged. That apotheosis of the objective spirit, in which reflection on the material process jutting into the spirit is banned from the outset as inferior. The unity of consciousness is that of the individual human consciousness. Even as a principle, it visibly bears its traces, and thus the traces of entity. For transcendental philosophy, the ubiquity of individual self-consciousness will indeed turn it into a universal that may no longer boast of the advantages of concrete self-certainty. But insofar as the unity of consciousness is modeled after objectivity, that is to say, insofar as it is measured by the possibility of constituting objects, it is the conceptual reflex of the total, seamless juncture of the productive acts in society which the objectivity of goods, their quote, object character, end quote, requires if it is to come about at all. Moreover, the solid, lasting, impenetrable side of the I mimics the world's impenetrability for conscious experience, as perceived by a primitive consciousness. The subject's real impotence has its echo in its mental omnipotence. The ego principle imitates its negation. It is not true that the object is a subject, as idealism has been drilling into us for thousands of years. But it is true that the subject is an object. The primacy of subjectivity is a spiritualized continuation of Darwin's struggle for existence. The suppression of nature for human ends is a merely natural relationship, which is why the supremacy of nature controlling reason and its principle is a delusion. When the subject proclaims itself a Baconian master, as in like Francis Bacon, Baconian master of all things, and finally their idealistic creator, it takes an epistemological and metaphysical part in this delusion. The practice of its rule makes it a part of what it thinks it is ruling. It succumbs like the Hegelian master. It reveals the extent to which in consuming the object, it is beholden to the object. What it does is the spell of that which the subject believes under its own spell. The subject's desperate self-exaltation is its reaction to the experience of its impotence, which prevents self-reflection. Absolute consciousness is unconscious. In Kantian ethics, this is grandiosely attested by an unconcealed contradiction. As an entity, the very subject Kant calls free and exalted is part of that natural context above which freedom would lift it. Plato's doctrine of ideas, a great stride towards demythologization, reiterates the myth. Under the name of essences, it perpetuates the conditions of dominance which man took over from nature and is now practicing. If the control of nature was a condition of demythologization, and to step in it, this dominance would have to spread to that other kind, lest it fall prey to the myth after all. But philosophy's stress on the constitutive power of the subjective moment always blocks the road to truth as well. This is how animal species like the dinosaur Triceratops or the rhinoceros drag their protective armor with them, an ingrown prison which they seem, anthropomorphically at least, to be trying vainly to shed. The imprisonment in their survival mechanism may explain the special ferocity of rhinoceroses, as well as the unacknowledged and therefore more dreadful ferocity of Homo sapiens. The subjective moment is framed, as it were, in the objective one. As a limitation imposed on the subject, it is objective itself. Quote, transcendental delusion, end quote. All this, according to traditional norms of philosophy, whether idealistic or ontological, has a touch of, some phrase in Greek, attached to it. One may say in a voice resonant with stringency, that what we do in such reflections without owning up to it is to presuppose as transmitting what we would deduce as transmitted, the subject and its thought. Just by being definitions, one may say, all our definitions are already definitions of thought. But it is not the purpose of critical thought to place the object on the orphaned royal throne once occupied by the subject. On that throne, the object would be nothing but an idol, The purpose of critical thought is to abolish the hierarchy. The delusion that the transcendental subject is the Archimedean fixed point from which the world can be lifted out of its hinges, this delusion, purely in itself, is indeed hard to overcome altogether by subjective analysis. For contained in this delusion, and not to be extracted from the forms of cogitative mediation, is the truth that society comes before the individual consciousness and before all its experience. The insight into the fact that thinking is mediated by objectivity does not negate thinking, nor does it negate the objective laws that make it thinking. The further fact that there is no way to get out of thinking points to the support found in non-identity, to the very support which thought, by its own forms, seeks and expresses as much as it denies it. Still transparent, however, is the reason for the delusion that is transcendental far beyond Kant. Why our thinking in the intentio obliqua will inescapably keep coming back to its own primacy, to the hypostasis of the subject. For while in the history of nominalism, ever since Aristotle's critique of Plato, the subject has been rebuked for its mistake of reifying abstraction. Abstraction itself is the principle whereby the subject comes to be a subject at all. Abstraction is the subject's essence. This is why going back to what it is not must impress the subject as external and violent. To the subject, what convicts it of its own arbitrariness and convicts its prius of a posteriority will always sound like a transcendent dogma. When idealism is criticized strictly from within, it has the handy defense of thus being sanctioned by the critic, of virtually having the criticism within itself, by the critic's use of its own premises, and accordingly being superior to the criticism. Objections from without, on the other hand, will be dismissed by idealism as pre-dialectical, belonging to the philosophy of reflection. But there is no need for analysis to abdicate in view of this alternative. Immanence is the totality of those identitarian positions, whose principle falls before immanent critique. As Marx put it, idealism can be made to, quote, dance to its own tune, end quote. The non-identity which determines it from within, after the criterion of identity, is at the same time the opposite of its principle, that which it vainly claims to be controlling. No immanent critique can serve its purpose wholly without outside knowledge. Of course, without a moment of immediacy, if you will, a bonus from the subjective thought that looks beyond the dialectical structure. That moment is the moment of spontaneity, and idealists should be the last to ostracize it, because without it there would be no idealism. Spontaneity breaks through an idealism whose inmost core was christened, quote, spontaneity. The subject of ideology lies under a spell from which nothing but the name of subjectivity will free it. Sorry, let me repeat that. The subject of ideology lies under a spell from which nothing but the name of subjectivity will free it, just as only the herb named Sneezejoy will free the enchanted dwarf nose in Wilhelm Hoff's fairy tale. This herb was kept a secret from the dwarf, and as a result he never learned to prepare, quote, pâté suzerain, the dish that bears the name of sovereignty in decline. No amount of introspection would let him discover the rules governing his deformity and his labor. He needs an outside impulse, the wisdom of, quote, Mimi the goose. To philosophy, and to Hegel's most of all, such an impulse is heresy. The limit of immanent critique is that the law of the immanent context is ultimately one with the delusion that has to be overcome. Yet that instant, truly the first qualitative leap, comes solely in the performance of immanent dialectics, which tends to transcend itself in a motion not at all unlike the passage from Platonic dialectics to the ideas, which, quote, are in themselves, end quote. If it becomes totally conclusive, dialectics would be the totality that goes back to the identity principle. This was the interest served against Hegel by Schelling, who thus invited jeers at the abdication of a thought in flight to mysticism. The materialistic moment in Schelling, who credited matter as such with something like a driving force, may contribute to that aspect of his philosophy. But neither can we hypostatize the leap, as Kierkegaard does, lest we blaspheme against reason. Our sense of dialectics makes us restrict dialectics. Yet our disappointment at philosophy's failure to awaken from its dream by its own motion, without any leap, as its need for something else, for something new, for that which its spell keeps at a distance, this disappointment is none other than the disappointment of a child who reads Half's fairy tale and mourns because the dwarf, though no longer misshapen, did not get a chance to serve the Duke his pâté suzerain. Okay, so that is the end of the third video of part 2 of negative dialectics. Of part 3. No, part 2 of negative dialectics, Video 3, part 2. Part 2 of negative dialectics is titled Negative Dialectics, Concept and Categories. It's a very large section with kind of like sectional breaks that don't have titles. So I'm reading it breaking it down into parts. The next part of the next video will begin with the heading, The Object's Preponderance. Thank you so much for listening.